Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be starting a new series where I look at the statistically best ground vehicle for each nation in the game of War Thunder. Now the first and obvious question is, what are the ground rules and what criteria are we using to determine the quote-unquote best vehicle? And for this one I decided to do something slightly different. For the last series looking at the worst vehicles, some individuals justifiably pointed out that win rate may not necessarily be the best indicator. That being said, I don't find KDs have any more success because they also have their own issues. So what I decided to do was a weighted system wherein a vehicle will be ranked in terms of where it sits in win rate and then ranked in terms of where it sits in KD, and those numbers will be added together. And the idea is that the best win rate gets a 1, the second best win rate gets a 2, and so on and so forth, and then the same for kill deaths, and then you add the numbers together and whoever has the lowest number is the quote-unquote best vehicle. Now one thing that I established with the last series was that anti-aircraft vehicles tend to have such anomalous stats in terms of win rate and KD that they don't really have an effective indicator in terms of how good they are, so anti-air vehicles will be excluded. Additionally, premium squadron and event vehicles all tend to be somewhat erratic in terms of their actual numbers. If you look at the top 5 vehicles for USA in terms of overall win rate, what you get are 5 vehicles, one of which is currently obtainable and the rest of which are currently basically unobtainable, and the fact that they are unobtainable and have been off the market for a long time is likely the reason why their stats are so good. And the one obtainable vehicle, the T20, is actually a somewhat uncommon premium vehicle to see, so it's usually only more experienced players that really bother with it. Additionally, you'll notice 2 of these vehicles are carbon copies of tech tree vehicles. These are the Twitch Drop M5 and the M1A1 Cup vehicle. The only reason their win rates are higher is because they are much rarer vehicles. I believe only one person has the Cup M1A1, and the Twitch Drop M5 was from a long time ago and has never been made available since. So part of the reason why their stats are so much higher than the tech tree vehicles, even though they're identical stat wise, is just because of the narrower player pool, and hopefully that gives you some idea as to why I'm only using tech tree vehicles. So the winner today, and because this is the best of series, it is actually the winner and not the loser, is the T26E5, the American heavy tank at 6.7. It currently has a 50.7% win rate and a 1.3 kills per death, so a pretty good stat line overall and perfectly fine for any vehicle. The T26E5 had a total score of 3, so it was very high up on the list in both areas, and honorable mentions do go out to both the Jumbo 76 and the T34, as both of those scored incredibly high as well. Also pretty notable that all of those vehicles are around 6.3 to 6.7, and you see a similar trend with all of the 6.3 to 6.7 vehicles, as that does appear to be America's strongest lineup, and I do think that's a trend we're going to see throughout this series, as we're going to have multiple vehicles clustered together from the same lineup, essentially, as how good the vehicles are around you, especially if you're a major nation, does influence both your win rate and how well you can generally perform. Kicking things off with the overall mobility, and you do have a 500 horsepower engine at 46.4 tons, and that's not exactly the best possible power to weight ratio. It's only about 10.8 horsepower per ton. Maximum forward speed of 40 kilometers an hour, maximum reverse speed of 13 kilometers an hour. Honestly, those two stats for a 6.7 vehicle are not bad at all and generally pretty competitive. A 13 kph reverse gear is certainly better than quite a few contemporary vehicles, and the 40 kph forward is perfectly fine. The power to weight is really what lets this vehicle down a bit, especially if you're using the vehicle stock. Before you have filters, transmission, engine, etc., the vehicle will feel noticeably more sluggish and will also be more sluggish to turn and rotate on soft ground until you have the tracks upgraded. So this is one of those vehicles where I would prioritize mobility upgrades because you will get a very high return on investment. And honestly, when you first start using it, it's going to be so painful to play, you're probably going to do that anyway. The armor on the T26E5 is really what sets it apart from the M26 Pershing. The M26 is the medium tank at the same battle rating and has a lot of similar stats, including the engine and the gun. However, the M26 is lighter but also has noticeably less armor. The armor on the T26E5 is part of the reason why it's commonly nicknamed the Jumbo Pershing, after the Jumbo Sherman that is also just a Sherman with more armor. The armor on the Jumbo Pershing is actually quite quite good. Across the frontal arc, it can basically eat the 88 and the 7.5 centimeters that you're going to find on things like tigers and panthers, and even the King Tiger's long 88 often has to aim for fairly specific weak points. There are some guns like the Russian 122 that can, for the most part, just click on you, although there are some parts of your armor that can block it. But generally speaking, a lot of enemies that are using APHE rounds are going to have some difficulty with your frontal arc. You do have to be aware that the machine gun port on the right hand side of the hull is a weak point, and pretty much any enemy that has gotten used to American heavies will aim for these machine gun ports because they've gotten used to things like the jumbo where it is also a weak point. What this does kind of mean though is that if you take corners around the left hand side, you will expose this weak point for the minimum amount of time possible to get a shot off, which can allow you to potentially avoid or confuse enemies, which is pretty solid. Now, a pretty common complaint that you'll hear from a lot of other people playing heavy tanks in this battle rating is that they have to play against some APDS rounds and some heat rounds. However, APDS and heat rounds do tend to have much narrower cones of damage, and against these kind of World War II era heavy tanks with 5 crew members, unless they hit ammo, they often don't kill you in a single shot. The enemy basically has to specifically aim for things like gunners in order to actually do meaningful damage. So while yes, some of the heat round and APDS rounds can go straight through your vehicles, these rounds tend to require relatively precise shots to do the damage they need to do, unlike the APHE rounds, which are the most likely threat of a one-shot. This also raises the interesting and somewhat awkward point in that the lower sides of the vehicle are not significantly better than you would really expect on a regular Pershing. So while you can angle, you need to be very careful of over-angling because the vast majority of enemies you fight using APHE rounds will have a ballistic cap on their rounds and thus will be able to bite in this angle pretty easily. One thing that I would recommend is it's important to remember that the left side of your turret is actually where your ammo rack is. So if you are about to take a hit, you definitely do not want to show the enemy the left side of your turret. You either want your turret directly facing the enemy where it's going to be a more difficult shot, or even want to turn your turret slightly to the left so they can only shoot the right side. Moving on to the firepower, and you do have the roof-mounted 50 cal, which is pretty nice. It does have good traverse and elevation arcs and is semi-stabilized, so it can be used to engage lighter vehicles and planes pretty efficiently. On top of that, 50 cals do a respectable amount of damage to enemy tracks, so don't be afraid to use it to knock somebody's tracks off if you see the opportunity. The gun on the T26E5, however, is pretty unremarkable, as you've had a gun like this basically for a few BR ratings now. The gun is the standard American 90mm, it is not stabilized. The chassis does have decent suspension, so you can keep it somewhat stable, especially at low speeds on flat level ground, but you do have to be somewhat careful of opponents that do have stabilized guns or that may be waiting for you in ambush. Now, the stock ammo for the T26E5 is pretty annoying. While the high explosive round is reasonably functional, it only really works against open top vehicles, but that's pretty standard. The stock solid shot armor piercing round is pretty useless in most cases, and you really need to upgrade this as quickly as possible. The M82 armor piercing high explosive round is just a rank 1 upgrade, and honestly I researched that before I researched parts because the stock AP round is so bad. That being said, the M82 round is fantastic. It's probably one of the most underrated rounds in the game. It has excellent penetration, it has excellent angle performance, even has a pretty good muzzle velocity, and the internal damage is often more than enough to get the job done. I absolutely love M82, and it is absolutely what you should be maining on this vehicle, and honestly the majority of vehicles that have access to it as well. You can upgrade to a smoke round, which is a pretty standard smoke round, nothing really special about it. If you use smoke rounds, taking 1 or 2 of them is not a bad idea. It's not the best, not the worst. You do get an APCR round, and it does have enough penetration that there are some enemies that you potentially might need it for. That being said, if you're consistently putting yourself in positions where you need over 200mm of penetration, you're probably making mistakes in terms of your positioning. This tank really should not be going toe-to-toe with things like Yag Tigers. So ultimately I do take some of these APCR just in case I desperately need it, but for the most part I would rather not rely on it if I can avoid it. Now, in the worst vehicle series, I had a segment here where I would recommend tips and tricks, but since these are the vehicles that the players are historically in these tech trees performing the best with, I'm just going to skip straight through that part and go into some of the reasons why I think these vehicles are successful. Now, I already hit on one of the reasons why I think the T26 T26E5 is successful, and that is the lineup. The American 6.7 lineup has a lot of vehicles that have overall pretty good performance stats. The T34 is a beast, the T26E1-1 is also a beast. Honestly, for all the hate it gets, the Pershing is not as bad as people think it is. While a lot of people think the Jumbo 76 is understated, it also works perfectly fine at this BR, and the CAS options for USA at this battle rating are pretty exceptional. I actually think USA 6.7 is a pretty underrated lineup. While you do have to fight quite a few of the Russian and German heavies, I think people really underestimate how potent the American heavies are at this battle rating. Of course, it does have a good lineup, but why specifically the T26E5? Why this tank in particular? Well, one of the reasons I think personally that this tank performs better than things like the T34, the T26E1-1, etc., is that the T26E5 actually strikes a bit of a balance in terms of armor mobility and firepower. The mobility is generally better than some of the other heavy tanks that you'll be fighting, especially the reverse gear at 13 kph. It's not quite as good as something like the Pershing in terms of overall horsepower per ton, but it still has the same top speed and honestly still accelerates pretty well once you get it fully upgraded. The armor, while not as potent as the T34, is still very good at catching poorly placed shots, and ultimately most of the time that's really all you need in order to be successful. And the gun, the American normal 90mm, may seem a little underpowered for this battle rating, but ultimately has a faster reload than both the T34 and the T26E1-1, so you do actually get off follow-up shots much faster, and especially if you get a good flanking position, the T26E5 is just a generally superior tank. On top of that, if you compare it to the M26, while yes, it does lose some horsepower per ton, the armor difference is so substantial that it's not hard to understand how your average player is having a lot more success in this than they are in the M26 Pershing. The T26E5 just has an excellent balance of armor that is good enough in most situations, mobility that is at least as good if not slightly better than many of its competitors, and a gun that combines a good enough reload with a good enough selection of shells. It's really not hard to see why the average American main is having some pretty good success with this vehicle. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of the T26E5. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.